Imagine you wake up one morning and your bank account is completely frozen. Not hacked. Not a glitch. The government froze it. On purpose. You go to the ATM and there's a line stretching around the block. You finally get to the front and the machine spits out the equivalent of $40. That is your limit for the day. You have rent due. You have groceries to buy. You have a business to run. And the most powerful institution in your country, the one that prints money, that promises stability, that literally holds your savings, has just told you quietly through a piece of paper taped to a glass door that it cannot keep its promises anymore. This happened in Argentina in 2001. It happened in Cyprus in 2013. It happened in Greece, in Lebanon, in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela. And it did not happen because these were reckless, chaotic, backwards places run by idiots. Some of them had Nobel laureates designing their economic policy. So what actually happens when a country goes broke? Not the textbook version. The real version. The one where ordinary people wake up one morning and discover that the rules they have been living by no longer apply. That is what we are going to talk about today. First, let us clear something up. Countries do not go bankrupt the way you or I go bankrupt. When a person goes bankrupt, there is a process, a judge, a court, a structure plan to pay back creditors over time. Your car might get repossessed. Is painful. But there is a system. Countries do not have that. There is no global bankruptcy court. There is no repo man for a nation. When a country runs out of money, it does not quietly file paperwork. It announces sometimes suddenly, sometimes after years of denial that it cannot pay what it owes. That announcement is called a sovereign default. And the fallout from that announcement reshapes everything. Not just bond markets. Not just interest rates. People's lives. Their savings. Their jobs. Their futures. But to understand how a country gets there, we need to go back to the beginning. To understand the machine before it breaks. Every country in the world spends money. Roads, hospitals, military, schools, salaries for government workers. And every country collects money, primarily through taxes. In a perfect world, those two numbers balance. You spend what you collect. Done. But no country in the world actually does that. Not consistently. Every government, at some point, spends more than it takes in. That gap is called a deficit. And the way governments cover that gap is by borrowing. They issue bonds. A bond is essentially a promise. You give us money today, we will give it back later, plus interest. Investors buy those bonds. Pension funds, foreign governments, banks, everyday people. They hand over cash today in exchange for that promise of repayment. This is not inherently reckless. Every major economy on Earth carries debt. The United States has over $33 trillion in national debt. Japan's debt is over 200% of its entire annual economic output. And neither of those countries is in crisis right now. So debt by itself is not the problem. The problem is when the debt becomes something you cannot manage. When the interest alone eats up so much of your annual budget that there is nothing left to actually run the country. When investors start to get nervous and demand higher interest rates to keep lending you money. And when those higher rates make your debt even harder to repay. Which makes investors even more nervous. Which pushes rates even higher. That spiral has a name. It is called a debt trap. And once you are in it, escaping requires either a miracle, a painful restructuring, or a crisis. Now here is the part that most people miss. Countries almost never just run out of money in the way a person runs out of money. What actually breaks is confidence. Think about what money is. It is a shared agreement, a collective belief. The piece of paper in your wallet is worth something because everyone agrees it is worth something. The bond to government issues is worth something because investors believe the government will honor it. The moment that belief starts to crack, everything accelerates. And it accelerates fast. Here is how it typically unfolds. A country has been running deficits for years. Maybe it borrowed heavily to build infrastructure, or to fight a war, or to survive a recession. Investors are watching, but they are patient as long as they believe the country can manage it. Then something changes. Maybe there is a political crisis. Maybe GDP growth slows. Maybe a global event like an oil price shock or a pandemic destroys tax revenue overnight. Suddenly, the math looks different to investors. They start pricing in the risk that this country might not pay them back. So they demand higher yields on new bonds. The government is now borrowing at 10% instead of 3%. Its debt payments balloon. It has to borrow more just to pay the interest on the debt it already has. The budget gets stretched. Essential services get cut. Citizens get angry. Political instability rises. That makes investors even more nervous. You see where this is going. Greece is a masterclass in this spiral. In 2009, Greece revealed that its budget deficit was actually twice as large as it had been reporting. It had been using financial instruments, with help from major investment banks, to hide the real numbers. When the truth came out, investors panicked. Greek bond yields exploded. The country lost access to affordable borrowing almost overnight. It needed a bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. But that bailout came with conditions. Severe austerity, cuts to pensions, to public sector wages, to healthcare. The unemployment rate hit 27%. Youth unemployment hit over 50%. And this was a country in the Eurozone with the backing of the most powerful economic bloc in the world. It still took nearly a decade to crawl out. Now imagine a country without that backing. Zimbabwe in the late 2000s took a different route. Rather than going to creditors and defaulting on its debts, its government simply printed money to cover its obligations. It printed and printed and printed. Inflation hit 11 million% in 2008. People were carrying cash in wheelbarrows to buy bread. The central bank issued a $100 trillion note. $100 trillion. It was worth about 40 US cents. The currency became worthless so fast that workers would demand to be paid twice a day because by afternoon, their morning wages had already lost half their value. That is not a sovereign default in the traditional sense. That is something worse. That is a currency collapse. And it is what happens when a government chooses to destroy the value of its money rather than admit it cannot pay its bills. Lebanon is the freshest wound. For decades, Lebanon maintained an artificially stable exchange rate between its pound and the US dollar. Banks were offering incredible interest rates on deposits, sometimes 9 or 10%, in a world where most savings accounts paid almost nothing. People poured money in. Lebanese diaspora abroad sent billions home. It looked like a success story. It was not. It was a Ponzi scheme dressed as a banking system. The central bank was using new deposits to pay the interest on old ones. There was no real engine underneath it. When the flow of fresh money slowed in 2019, the whole thing cracked. The pound lost over 90% of its value. Banks imposed informal capital controls. People could not access their own savings. Doctors, engineers, teachers, people who had worked their entire lives and saved responsibly. They watched their life savings evaporate in real time. What makes Lebanon particularly brutal is that it was not some unstable frontier economy. It was known as the Paris of the Middle East. It had one of the most sophisticated financial sectors in the region, which should tell you something uncomfortable. Sophistication and stability are not the same thing. So what happens after a country defaults? Is it permanent? Is it the end? Not usually. Countries that default do not disappear. They negotiate. They restructure their debt. They go to creditors and say, "We cannot pay you what we owe on the original terms. But here is a new deal. We will pay you back over 30 years instead of 10. We will pay 70 cents on the dollar instead of 100. Take it or leave it." Most creditors take it, because something is better than nothing. Argentina has defaulted 9 times in its history. 9 times. And it is still a country. Still borrowing. Still issuing bonds. Because creditors, even after getting burned, eventually come back. They always come back. The appetite for yield, for return, for profit, it overrides memory. It overrides caution, which is why the same mistakes repeat. Not because the people making them are stupid, because the incentives push them in that direction every time. And that is the uncomfortable center of all of this. The system is not broken. This is how the system works. Debt builds confidence, cracks, crises happen, the pain lands on ordinary people, governments restructure, investors take a haircut and recover, and then the whole cycle begins again. The International Monetary Fund estimates that since 1800 there have been over 250 sovereign debt crises around the world, not isolated accidents. Not rare black swans, a recurring feature of the global financial system. Which brings us to right now. Global debt, public and private, is at the highest level in human history. Several emerging economies are quietly in distress. Interest rates rose sharply in 2022 and 2023. And for countries that borrowed in US dollars, those repayments became dramatically more expensive overnight. Sri Lanka collapsed in 2022. Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia have all been in debt restructuring negotiations in recent years. These are not small stories. They are previews. Here is the question worth sitting with. We have built a global financial system that essentially requires countries to borrow in order to function, depends on continuous growth to justify that borrowing, and has no real mechanism to prevent the same cycle from repeating. The people who designed the system are not villains. Many of them are brilliant. But brilliance and wisdom are not the same thing either. So the next time you hear that a country is in financial trouble, and you will hear it sooner than you think, remember that it did not just happen. It was built brick by decisions that all seemed reasonable at the time. And somewhere right now, in a country you may not be paying attention to, someone is standing in an ATM, watching a limit they did not set tell them how much of their own money they are allowed to have today. The machine is still running.